So let's get started. I now have the pleasure of introducing our two distinguished panelists. First, Attorney Dan Leftwich is President and Legal Director of Resilient Community Network and founder of Evolutionary Law, a public interest firm focused on community rights and environmental protection. Formerly a co-owner of a successful Washington, D.C. law firm specializing in antitrust and fraud litigation, Dan shifted his work in 2009 to focus on local communities and the rights of nature. His firm has helped Colorado communities defend public health and the environment, including efforts to limit fracking. Today, as you'll hear, his work includes protecting Boulder County residents, wildlife, and open space from the impacts of intensive flight training operations. And Attorney Steve Tabor is a member of our QC Legal Advisory Council and a partner at Leach Tishman, where he leads the aviation and aerospace group and co-leads the environmental group. A former FAA attorney, he brings deep expertise in aviation law and airport development, and now advises municipalities and communities on aviation noise and emissions. He also previously served as an assistant attorney general in Illinois, focused on environmental enforcement. So thank you both so much for being here. And Dan, why don't you start us off? Thank you.
All right. Thank you to Quiet Communities for the opportunity to address your audience about these important issues. I'm just going to express my opinions and my view of things in Boulder County, including the legal and factual matters. But I have a lot to go through, short amount of time, so I'm just going to hit the overview, and then if there's questions, we'll address them at the end. So first, a little bit of orientation. There are four, this is a map of Boulder County, and which is northwest of Denver. And there are four general aviation airports in Boulder County. At the bottom of the map is KBJC. That's Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport, the largest of the four, and the source of the vast majority of the flight school traffic that affects all of the communities in Boulder County. To the northwest is Boulder Municipal Airport, KBDU, and then north of that is KLMO, that's Longmont Airport, Vance Brand Airport, and then to the east is the town of Erie's Airport. Now this is kind of a, let's see here. I'm going to see how I need to move from one screen to the next. There we go. Now, just seeing the airports in the map doesn't do Boulder County justice. This is a map of the open space areas, public open space in Boulder County. And you can see that they are all over the county and particularly around areas that are affected by airplane noise. Boulder County has citizens have acquired over 100,000 acres of public open space and conservation easements. We have paid more than $500 million into a trust fund for that purpose since 1993. And to acquire, restore, and protect open space lands and water. This is important to Boulder County residents, past, present, and future. Boulder County open space is quite popular with people worldwide. In 2024, there were more than 1.8 million visits to Boulder County open space properties, and that is possibly a conservative estimate. We take protection of wildlife very seriously in Boulder County. We have raptor area closures throughout the year where visitors cannot enter certain open space areas for golden eagles, burrowing owls, bald eagles, and the like. However, airplanes don't know those boundaries. I just want to give you a little view of what we're talking about here. This is Pella Crossing in Boulder County, just west of the Longmont Airport. Uh, this is a place that I visit regularly. However, I go there less frequently now because the airplane noise is really troublesome. This is a view of Chautauqua Park in the city of Boulder. Kind of an iconic view of the Flatirons in Boulder. But this is the reality in Boulder County now. You can see that the Boulder Daily Camera just did an article highlighting the flight school aircraft noise over neighborhoods. It's continuing and it's unrelenting. And Boulder County has described it as residents can't open their windows, they can't use outdoor spaces, cannot sleep without interruption. This is affecting the quality of life in Boulder County in a huge way. This is what the cumulative effects of the aircraft noise over Boulder County feels like. This is an image created by a Boulder County resident, taken from actual operations data over a period of time, and then putting it in graphics. And you can see all 4 airport areas. You can see just the intense coverage of the entire county. There is no escape from the lead and the noise. I don't have to tell your members and your audience what the dangers are of aircraft noise, but I have, become a recent participant in this madness. And so the aircraft noise I'm really feeling it over the last year and a half. And so I know that it's extremely dangerous. Now, when we talk about aircraft noise from these piston engine aircraft, we can't separate it from the effect on humans and the effect on wildlife. Most people don't really think about this because wildlife are hidden for the most part. But the National Park Service has a great site containing lots of data and science studies on the effects of noise on wildlife. So I highly encourage you to visit it. Now, you can't separate lead poisoning and lead pollution from noise when you're talking about these piston engine aircraft. I won't go into detail about the effects of lead on children and what the studies say. I highly recommend that you visit a presentation that Boulder County residents put on with expert witnesses, community leaders, and members of the community, in which all of the harm from lead pollution from these piston engine planes was explained in great detail, and the efforts that we're taking to try and reduce it. It's called leadoverhead.com. Now, the core issue here, in my view, is what are called touch and go operations, where flight school students fly to an airport, land, but do not taxi and stop. They simply touch down, take off again at full power, and then do a pattern, what's called a pattern operation, which is supposed to be close to the runway, but in a prescribed area, but it ends up being in a vastly wider pattern. And then they just do this over and over and over again. Now, studies have shown that this is the area where the lead and noise pollution, these touch and go operations leading to pattern operations, very low altitude because they're close to the airport, That's where the noise and lead is at its most intense. There are also public safety hazards at issue here, including we've had multiple plane crashes in our neighborhoods, basically, in rural neighborhoods in Boulder County. We've had near misses, pilots calling Longmont Airport basically the death zone. And there's been low flight targeting by pilots over neighborhoods, over specific homes. And so the risk to neighborhoods is high. The risks really come from Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport. Last year, the FAA finally paid a visit and pointed out that Rocky Mountain has become the airport with the most safety incidents in the country. And they called it potentially significant events, or PSEs. You got to love the acronyms. But it's basically safety risks. And so it's coming from the vast expansion of flight school operations at Rocky Mountain that then got pushed to our airport in Longmont, Boulder's airport in Boulder. Now, unbeknownst to us in Boulder County, flight schools at Rocky Mountain Airport created flight training areas, practice areas throughout Boulder County with secret FAA approval, meaning they didn't disclose this to us, and without input from Boulder County and without an environmental impact study. I'll show you what those are just briefly. This is a map showing the practice areas, the training areas over huge swaths of Boulder County open space. And of course, there's cities and there's neighborhoods tucked in and around these open space areas. So it is intense flight training, including aerobatic training, which is cutouts and stall maneuvers, very low altitude training operations at times. For the last 5 years, Rocky Mountain Airport and the FAA have repeatedly changed what are called visual flight rule flight paths throughout Boulder County. Again, with the flight school input, but without input from Boulder County and the residents. This is what is driving communities like Lafayette and Louisville and Superior insane, because the flight paths coming out of Rocky Mountain Airport have been diverted. They're going to the northern training areas over Boulder County, but they have to go over Lafayette and Louisville in order to get there. And they go at low altitudes. As a result of all of this noise and lead coming from Rocky Mountain Airport, Boulder County and the town of Superior in 2024 filed suit against Jefferson County, which owns Rocky Mountain Airport, over the public nuisance coming from primarily touch and go operations. And they asked the court for an injunction to tell Jefferson County it must stop these touch and go operations at RMMA. Now the case has wound its way to the Court of Appeals. We've had several decisions, adverse outcomes for Boulder County and Superior. According to some, I see more benefits coming from the suit, but it is headed to the Colorado Supreme Court probably in a few weeks. I'll have more about that if people have questions. It's an important case. So now, Boulder County and Superior do not own an airport. And so they felt that they had freedom to take action on behalf of their citizens. But the question keeps coming up for all of the citizens of Boulder County that are in or near cities that do own airports. Why are they not standing up for their citizens? The constant refrain we get from city councils is our hands are tied. Well, who tied them? I'm going to give you just an overview of what the FAA's control of cities is based on, in my view, again. So there's preemption. Federal law generally preempts local laws that are either in conflict or that disrupt pervasive federal policies. Then there are subsidies that the FAA uses to both induce cities and bind cities to the federal policy, which I believe is to make these airports, these general aviation airports, available to flight schools for training, among other uses. And then there are grant conditions that go along with the subsidies. I'll explain a little bit about each one. Preemption, again, I explained what that generally is, but there's a case in the Supreme Court called City of Burbank, which is the general Supreme Court case that says cities are preempted from enacting noise regulations over aircraft that are operating in flight because it would essentially disrupt the federal pervasive control over the navigable airways in the United States. However, there are some limits. The court limited to when cities use their police powers, the power to protect public health and safety in order to enact those regulations. The court then said, well, but there are still these proprietor powers if the airport owner is the proprietor. And so they have certain powers because they can be sued for nuisances coming from their airport. They have to have the power to limit their liability. So that's the proprietary powers exception. Now, the FAA does a good job of confusing the limits of preemption. There are limits, and confusing the scope of the proprietary powers. I believe the scope is broader than they let on. Then the FAA uses subsidies through the Airport Improvement Grant Program. This comes in two forms: free infrastructure for the flight schools. Roughly 70% of all operations at the Longmont Airport are from flight schools originating at Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport. They do fly up to us, do touch and goes pattern operations all day, pay nothing to our community, our airport, and then they fly back. And then there are grants for cities to improve their airports. The airport's budgets in a lot of these cities are deeply in the red because they just refused to impose charges on users of the airport, flight schools, and private plane owners. And so a lot of them are in the hole. And so they use these subsidies to kind of fill those holes. But that sets the hook for the FAA. Then they come in with the grant conditions that the cities must comply with if they're going to take the money. So the first is what I call the Mother May I clause. That gives the FAA a veto over any city's regulations to limit noise. So by regulating touch and go operations, for example, cities have to submit a detailed noise study. They have to justify it. And then the FAA can still veto it. And we've learned that the FAA virtually always vetoes it. Then there's a provision where cities cannot ban the use of leaded fuel at their airports. If they violate that, it will cost them $5,000 a day in fines. Pretty coercive. And then there's the clause that the city of Boulder has recently encountered, which is the perpetual duration clause. So no matter how small the grant, no matter what it's for, the FAA now says, you, the city, cannot close this airport ever without our approval if you took an FAA grant long time ago, recently, it doesn't matter. So what are we doing to fight back? I call these the tools of resistance. And I know I'm running a little short on time here, but I'm just going to lay these out for you. The most important of these is really using Open Records Act laws. Colorado has a very good Open Records Act and open meetings laws, and to discover documents and data from the cities and from the airports to see what is actually going on. What is the scope of the operations at the airport? What's the status of the budget for the airport and the financial data for the airport? We also call on scientific experts, like the lead presentation that I showed you earlier. And we have found in Boulder County, there are a lot of citizen experts. There are some very smart people, very capable people that we're using to compile data and to make presentations and really to inform us for other efforts. Then we've really worked hard to develop media contacts and present ourselves as reliable media partners so that they know we're going to present the facts. We're not just going to spout a lot of opinions. And then I've got some other tools where I basically say bypass the normal channels. They want you to use the normal channels like filing complaints on the complaint hotline. No, we stopped doing that. We just started sending them all to the city council. And that's when we started to get responses. And finally, you need to think outside what I call the lawless regulatory box. The FAA has created this box. They've created it so it's basically a free regulation zone for the flight schools and other users. And we really don't have much access to that. So you have to think outside of it. Now, there have been some successes that we have had over the last few years. And again, there's a lot of here, and I won't go into great detail. People can look at it at their leisure. But the Boulder County and Superior case, even though they lost at the Court of Appeals, lost partially, the case is still open on some issues, and it's going to the Supreme Court. They smoked out, so to speak, certain legal issues that we can now dispense with, I think. And these were legal myths that have been used by the industry and the FAA to basically keep people thinking, well, there's nothing we can do because of preemption and the city of Burbank case. In addition, Longmont citizens really, in the last year and a half, we've basically broken the media monopoly. There used to be a monopoly on the media. We could count on it. After every city council meeting, the airport director and a member of the city council who is favorable to the airport would have quotes in the local paper, and they would control the narrative. That has changed drastically. We have now had multiple guest opinions written, and they've all been really great. And this has happened in Boulder as well. Boulder citizens, by the way, Longmont has also, the city council is making actions towards landing fees as a result of our pressure. And then the city recently dissolved the Airport Advisory Board, which was basically an industry channel that helped them control the narrative at the airport. Boulder citizens, the city of Boulder, they made efforts to basically close Boulder Airport over, at the end of their grant obligations. But then the FAA came in and said, well, those grant obligations never end. And so that's kind of an ongoing saga, including tonight. Boulder is supposed to be meeting to decide whether to go back and start taking FAA grants again. So to be continued. And then I just want to recognize Boulder County and Jefferson County citizens that have been working on these issues for many years. This isn't just all recent activities. So we're making progress. It's incremental, but I'm actually happy to be included with all of them. So if you want to learn more, there's a website that is very informational, saveourskiesalliance.org. And then our website is resilient-community.net. So thanks for your patience.
Dan, thank you so much. I can already feel that there will probably need to be a part 2 to this discussion, because I think we'll all be eager to hear about what's happening with the lawsuit, etc.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. I'm glad to be part of this conversation because this is an issue that affects a growing number of communities. It is still not well understood by the public or, frankly, by many decision makers. My purpose today is a modest but important one. I want to explain how the law sees this problem. I want to talk about why relief can be difficult even when the burden is on a community is very real. And I want to outline where communities still have meaningful tools to press for change. This is not an area where easy answers are plentiful, but it is an area where understanding the legal framework can help communities advocate more effectively and more realistically. Let me start with a point that I think is very important. When communities complain about repeated aircraft noise and pollution, they are not imagining the problem and they are not simply resisting change. In many cases, they are describing something real: repetitive overflights, disruption of sleep, loss of quiet, interference with daily life, and concern about what repeated operations mean not only for noise, but also for air quality and public health. These impacts are often cumulative. A single overflight may be tolerable, but what wears people down is repetition. The sense that the noise keeps returning, that outdoor space is no longer peaceful, that windows cannot be open, that conversations are interrupted, and that the ordinary use and enjoyment of home has changed. So before we even get to the legal framework, it is important to recognize that the lived experience comes first. The legal questions arise only after the community is already dealing with the burden. There is a mismatch in this area between how communities experience harm and how the law is set up to recognize it. People experience aircraft impacts in human terms. They experience recurrence, interruption, timing, loss of peace, the fifth overflight, the 15th overflight, the inability to sit outside, the inability to open windows, the sense that this is happening again tomorrow and the day after that. But the legal system does not always look at the problem that way. It often looks at categories of authority, administrative procedure, accepted metrics, and whether the agency followed the required steps. That gap between the lived experience and legal recognition is where a great deal of frustration begins. What, yeah, one reason communities become so frustrated so quickly is that they quite reasonably assume that if the aircraft are affecting their town, then their town should be able to fix it. But aviation does not work that way as at all, as Dan pointed out earlier. Control over navigable airspace and flight procedure is largely federal. The FAA plays the central role. That means local governments usually do not have the power people assume they have to direct air traffic in the air, redesign flight paths on their own, or simply order an end to the operations causing the problem. This does not mean that local governments are irrelevant. They are not, but it does mean their authority is much narrower than most people expect. And that is often the first hard truth communities encounter. The legal term for this is preemption. Preemption means the federal law occupies enough of the field that state and local governments cannot regulate in ways that conflict with or intrude upon that federal system. In plain English, it means that communities may live with the consequences of aviation activity without having direct control over the core decisions that produce those consequences. This is why residents often feel that they're being told, in effect, you are close enough to suffer the impact, but too far away from the legal levers to stop it directly. That is also why community advocacy in this area has to be strategic, because if direct local regulation is largely off the table, you have to know where the real pressure points are. One of the main pressure points is process. A lot of aviation advocacy succeeds or fails not because the community shouted the loudest, but because it built a factual and procedural record that the agency had to confront. This is where people need to shift from saying, this is unfair, to saying, here's the operation, Here's what it is doing on the ground. Here are the assumptions the agency used. Here's what was left out, and here's why that matters. That may sound a lot less satisfying than demanding immediate relief, but in this field, process is often where the real work gets done. That brings me to NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. NEPA is important, but it's often misunderstood. NEPA is not a law that guarantees the public a particular substantive outcome. It does not say the agency must choose the least noisy option or even the option that the community prefers. What NEPA does require is that the agency take a hard look at the environmental consequences before acting, disclose those consequences, and explain its reasoning. That matters because it gives communities a way to challenge bad assumptions, incomplete analysis, missing data, and agency decisions that do not square with what is actually happening. But NEPA is still at the bottom a process statute. It gives communities an opening. It does not promise them a win. That distinction is important because communities need to know both the value and limits of the tool they are using. This is another major source of disconnect. Communities experience aircraft noise as repeated intrusion, but agencies often rely on aggregate metrics that average or smooth impacts over time. The problem with that is obvious to anyone living under repeated operations. People do not experience an annualized average. They experience events, they experience clustering, they experience the early morning overflight, the repeated training pattern, the cumulative wear of interruption over the course of a day. So a neighborhood can feel heavily burdened while the official analysis concludes there is no significant impact. And when that happens, residents often feel dismissed. They feel that the system has translated a real and persistent burden into a technical conclusion that does not resemble life on the ground. This is not just a communication problem, it is a structural problem in the way aviation impacts are often assessed. Now, having said all that, I do not want to leave anyone with the impression that communities are powerless. They are not, but they are most effective when they are disciplined. First, communities should document carefully, not just generalized complaints, but dates, times, recurring patterns, and the specific ways operations are affecting their daily life. Second, they need to understand the operation itself. Is this flight training, pattern work, a route issue, vectoring, a procedural change? If you cannot identify the operation, it is much harder to challenge it effectively. Third, they should engage the administrative process early and specifically. Comments are most useful when they are concrete, factual, and tied to what the agency is actually assuming or proposing. Fourth, communities should push for transparency. What data was used? What alternatives were considered? What assumptions drove the analysis? Was the agency studying the real world operation or a sanitized version of it? And fifth, they should build coalitions, local officials, neighborhood groups, public health voices, technical experts, and lawyers all matter when they are aligned. In this area, success is not always dramatic. Sometimes success means getting a better record. Sometimes it means exposing a gap in the agency's analysis. Sometimes it means forcing a more honest explanation. Sometimes it means building pressure for operational changes that are narrower than what the community initially hoped for, but still meaningful. Sometimes the first victory is simply getting the problem recognized in the right terms. That matters because communities often lose time and momentum pursuing remedies that are largely unavailable, when they would be better served by focusing on the places where evidence, process, and persistence can actually move the ball. So the point I want to leave you is this. The difficulty communities face is not proof that the harm is imaginary. It is proof that the legal framework is heavily federalized, deeply procedural, and often not well designed to capture the way persistent aviation impacts are actually experienced on the ground. Once communities understand that, they can become much more effective. They can stop wasting energy on closed doors and start focusing on pressure points that matter: documentation, transparency, technical precision, administrative engagement, coalition building, and persistence. That is not a quick fix, but it's usually the beginning of a serious one. Thank you.
Steve, thank you so much. There's a lot in there, and I just want to let the audience know that we'll share, when we send you the video link, we'll share resources, including the websites Dan cited, Steve's email, and other information related to his slides. I'm going to just move quickly into questions and move through them. Some are comments, but it would be helpful to hear your thoughts. One person is asking if, Jamie, would you like to start, or do you have a question?
I just wanted to ask one question. Maybe it's for Dan, maybe it's for Steve. What is driving the growth in these operations?
I can.
You want to go, Dan? Go ahead.
Sure. We have, through our discovery efforts, we have learned a lot about where our flight school growth at Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport began. It was an expansion program in 2019 from the Airport Directors Initiative. It was coupled with, so a great expansion of the number of flight school planes. It involved the FAA because they were asking for more parking spots at the airport to be built, essentially. So the FAA was involved, and yet there was no environmental impact study or analysis done. And we have since learned that a lot of the larger flight schools are basically funded by private equity groups that have essentially franchised. They saw an opportunity. They saw basically money available to students from organizations like Sallie Mae and loans money, and so they basically started acquiring flight schools around the country. And some have modernized them and some haven't. Some of these flight schools are, the planes are quite old. So we believe that's where it really began.
I'll just add that nationwide, there's been a need for pilots, and that has sort of driven the flight training schools to open up across the country. There are this is not a problem that is solely limited to Colorado, but as is evident from the number of people on this webinar, there are a lot of people who are affected by flight training, and so that it's twofold. It's a the pilots are needed to take the place of a lot of retiring pilots that from the Vietnam era and thereafter, and the other thing is a lot of foreign students are coming in to take flying lessons as well. A lot of the air forces in some of the smaller countries send their soldiers, their pilots to be to places in the United States, and that is a very lucrative place for them to. It's very lucrative business for the foreign for the flight schools.
Yeah. Thank you. Trish, if I may, I just have one more basic question. In terms of the altitude, how do you define, it's twofold, how do you define low altitude? And does some of these low altitude flights, do they evade any kind of monitoring, because they're flying so low?
The
Go ahead, Steve.
the general feeling is that and what the FAA talks about is navigable airspace. Anything above 400 feet AGL, above ground level, is considered to be navigable airspace, meaning that you can fly an airplane into it. The only thing is that navigable airspace can go down to zero in approaches and in departure areas to airports. So they can be at a much lower altitude as they're landing. And this is particularly true with flight training pattern studies. If they stay close to the airport, sometimes they don't get above 400 feet, even though they're supposed to be above 400 feet when once before they turn and make the downwind leg of their pattern. So I don't think that they're invading any kind of process. They're supposed to have the black box, that the transponder that so that they can keep track of where they are. And now that now that the FAA has moved more or less from from radar to GPS, it's a lot harder for smaller aircraft to evade detection.
I would just add, Jamie, that the navigable airspace over congested areas is actually 1,000 feet above the highest point in a 2,000-foot radius of the plane. And for example, the pattern around the Longmont Airport, which is a prescribed pattern, it's not set by the FAA, but it's what they're supposed to use. They say in the pattern document, you're supposed to stay above 1,000 feet. And they can do that, except when they're on the landing glide path or the takeoff, obviously. But there's a huge issue here. And the lived experience is that many people are now tracking these planes using ADS-B data and using the city's own airport tracking operations data. And so they can see what the above ground level altitudes are for these flights. And some of them have been shocking. And their experience has been when they comment to the FAA or they file a complaint with the FAA, oftentimes the local FAA rep just says, well, you're using an app that gives a misleading altitude, right? So it's basically, don't believe your eyes, don't believe what you're seeing. This is legal. And so that's where frustration really comes in, because we're talking about very low overhead over homes, right? And so I'm just telling you the lived experience here. And we have access to robust data that tells a story that pilots are taking advantage of the fact that they're close enough to the airport to say it's necessary for takeoff or landing. So therefore they can be under that prescribed altitude. I hope I didn't overstate
No,
your answer.
thank you. And there's no, I mean, it just makes me think, is there any feedback that, the airport can give to pilots, any kind of report cards or something for these sorts of issues, where there's just nothing that's done along those lines?
Well, Longmont Airport, for example, has what, as Steve points out, airports all around the country have this problem, and many of them have what are called voluntary noise abatement policies or procedures. They're voluntary because the cities don't think they can enforce them because of FAA jurisdiction. And a lot of times these voluntary noise abatement policies will say, we reach out to pilots when they are, reportedly violating the terms of our noise abatement procedures. They're flying touch and goes at midnight, or they're going underneath the required altitude. But we see no evidence of those communications. We really don't have any way of knowing. There should be a report card. And it should be on the website of the airport. It should be visible to the public so that people can start seeing who are the responsible flight schools? Who are the irresponsible? I wholly agree.
I will point out that there are some airports that take these kinds of issues seriously, particularly with respect to maybe not so much flight training, but general aviation. Naples, Florida is a good example. I mean, there's still a ton of issues between the residents of the city and the airport, but the airport tries try at least tries to enforce its voluntary noise abatement procedures by shaming the pilots that publishing the names of the people who are in violation, of the voluntary noise abatement, and with the idea that if the public knows, then there's going to be some kind of public shaming, I guess, to for that, and to a certain extent that has worked okay with Naples, and at least from what I've heard. But they're still voluntary and they're still unenforceable, and that's a big issue.
Thank you both.
Thanks. And have Dan, I think this question is for you. Have you engaged departments of health, departments of health in the issue, around lead and noise? And Steve, have you seen communities that are successful with that approach?
I'll just give you my answer. I have not personally engaged with the Colorado Department of Public Health and the Environment. However, people in Boulder County and people that are working on these issues have. And in fact, the Department of Public Health in Colorado did its own study of children's blood lead levels living near airports. And it basically confirmed what was the result of other studies done, for example, the Reed Hillview Airport study in California. And as a result, the Colorado DPHE had a plan to send out postcards to all of the zip codes where people are living within a certain distance from a general aviation airport where piston engine airplanes, so that they could be informed that there is lead pollution coming from this airport, and that they can have their children tested. To date, the first attempt, we didn't get, none of us who live in the vicinity of airports in the Boulder Valley got one of those postcards. They said, well, it was a clerical error. And then they were going to redo it. And this was just in the last probably 9 months. And it still hasn't happened. But yes, we're pushing on them to make this an issue that people need to be informed about.
I'll just add that when flight procedures are changed, or when there's a capital project at an airport and a NEPA study is required, NEPA, the FAA believes that NEPA does not require them to do a health risk analysis, despite the fact that a lot of the regulations say that a health risk analysis should be done when you do an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement. And the courts have generally upheld the FAA's determination, deferring to them, saying that they're the ones that know whether or not there is a health risk, or whether or not they need to do a health risk analysis. Now, there's been a lot of pushback about that, and this is sort of a new area of trying to push back with respect to the airports. So this is particularly true with general aviation airports, but it's also true with commercial airports, like the larger airports with scheduled flights, because of ultrafine particles, and that's another big air quality issue.
Thank you so much. And I do just want to acknowledge that we have many questions and a lot of really great questions. So I think what we'll do is we'll run through a few of them quickly. There are some easier ones, but I think we'll also share the questions with Steve and Dan. And, if you even could answer a few of them, I think that would be amazing. And we'll also plan a part 2 of this discussion because it's excellent. First, very easy question. What's the case number on the Supreme Court case?
On the
Colorado.
Yeah. It has not been filed. This petition for certiorari has not been filed yet. It will be in probably the next week.
Okay.
So it only has a Court of Appeals number. I can drop that in a chat if we're I don't have it in front of me. So.
We'll include that in our response.
Yeah,
there's also someone in a community experiencing 7,000 flyovers a month over her home. And she's just asking if there's one way to get started, what would be the one thing you would recommend to just get the process started of speaking up?
Steve, you want to take that on?
Well, to start, you need to talk to the airport and see if they're doing anything about that. Because before you go to any other kind of method of trying to address the problem, you need to go to the source, at least someone who has some power to address those issues and see what they say, see what they're doing. If they stonewall you, move up the ladder, contact the FAA. I strongly advise to doing that sort of thing before you consider litigation. I will tell you, litigation is expensive, and it's a lever you can use, but as I said in my presentation, the changes are incremental. And litigation is only one way of trying to push the airport and the flight schools. As a resident, you have a couple other possibilities in terms of pursuing a tort action against the flight schools or the pilots that are flying over your head, of a nuisance or trespass, those kinds of things. Those are state law issues. So you need to talk to a lawyer in your state, or that is licensed to practice in your state regarding that. And the only thing that, in general, the only thing you can get is damages. The biggest issue in those kinds of cases is causation, proving that the high blood pressure that you have is a direct result of the aircraft flying overhead. That's the biggest problem.
Thanks, Steve. That was.
I would also just add, I've listed on one of my slides the tools of resistance. I would start there. I would start using Open Records Act requests, find out what your city open records procedure is. Usually it's online and it's very easy to just make a request for documents. For example, ask about, what are what's the system used at the airport for recording operations data? So you can start to find out, who are the flight schools that are making these flights, because often it's difficult to find that information out. So I've listed a lot of different tools, and I would just say pick some, but actually start in your community and find out others are probably feeling the same pain. So
thank you. I'm just going to try to get in 2 more comments, questions. One is about unleaded aviation gas and whether that's kind of come into your conversations, Dan. in Colorado?
It has.
Yes.
There has been an effort at the state level to push state grants so that cities can get grant money to bring in the infrastructure, the fuel tanks, the basic infrastructure for unleaded fuel, while they still are selling leaded fuel because they are prevented from stopping that by the FAA. And so we actually have, I think, several cities that have applied for those grants and that are getting the infrastructure in place for unleaded fuel. There is an airport south of Denver called Centennial, which has been selling unleaded 94 octane unleaded fuel for several years. But I will point out that the FAA has set a goal of making the transition away from leaded fuel by 2030. We don't have any confidence that that's actually going to hold. And there's a problem because the FAA controls the certification process for new unleaded fuels. So they control the supply, basically. Pilots control the demand. At Centennial Airport, I think the latest numbers were only 19% of their fuel sales are unleaded fuel, even though it's been available for several years now. So yes, there are halting steps going on, but we're trying to move it forward with carrots and incentives at this point.
That's great. And I'm just going to read this last question. I've struggled for years to sift federal law and FAA policies as to whether local airport taxes are legal in the US and could be used by localities as a mitigation option. I know a couple cities in Europe use noise taxes, but does federal law preempt that in the US?
Yes.
It does preempt it. Okay, that's very simple. To our guests, Dan and Steve, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and experience and helping us all to understand some of the things that can be done and that you are trying to do related to flight training. Quiet communities.